Chris MacKowski of Emerging Civil War, and I am walking down the sunken road at Antietam. You can see the observation tower there behind me. And we would need like a Antietam expert like Kevin Pollack to come out here and give you all the blow-by-blow actions of what's taking place out here. I'm just out taking a couple pictures today because it is a beautiful day to be out here. And I wanted to take a second because it's one of those days that you're just glad to be out on a battlefield. A battlefield that, maybe you're not the expert in, but it's a beautiful day to fall in love with a battlefield like that.
All right. Well, everybody, let's welcome to the stage here Dr. Chris MacKowski. Chris, welcome to the channel.
Thanks so much for having me today, Charlie. I really appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So reading up on you, I see that you're editor-in-chief and co-founder of Emerging Civil War. My last count on you, you've authored and co-authored over 24 books, various articles on the Civil War as well. You were on the board for Central Virginia Battlefield Trust, advisory on the Civil War Roundtable Congress, and member of Antietam Institute and U.S. Grant Association as well.
So I try to keep busy. I'm actually not on the board for the U.S. Grant Association, but I am a member of the Homestead Association, so different organizations. Okay. But the Homestead Association is where Grant was born and then grew up down in Southeast Ohio.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, welcome to the channel.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. And I'm going to tell all your listening audience, your viewing audience, Charlie has been working to get in touch with me, and I have been like a slippery pig in a pig catching contest. Hard for him to wrangle, and through my own fault and schedule. So I want you guys to know just how hard this dude works to bring you history. He is working for you. So thank you for your patience, Charlie.
Absolutely, no problem at all. It's definitely a pleasure to get a great mind on the channel for sure.
Is there someone else coming on besides me?
Oh no, only your mind. So, all right. So I wanted to kind of kick this thing off by trying to get to understand how did this all get started for you?
Yeah, my Civil War origin story really goes back to my daughter. She's 31 now, although she keeps telling me she's 29 the past 2 years. But when she was 4, we did a family vacation to Washington, D.C., and we were there for a few days, and we'd gone through the monuments and the museums, and we were supposed to go to the zoo one afternoon. So to fill up a morning, we decided, well, let's try this battlefield out at Manassas and just kind of see what's out there. We'll let her run around if nothing else, And I didn't have a particular interest in Civil War stuff, but it was something to do and a place she could run around outside. And so we get out there. And we get out of the car, and she sees that giant statue of Stonewall Jackson that is there in the middle of the field. And she's like, oh, my gosh, what's that? She comes running out there. She just thinks it's the coolest thing. Oh, my gosh, look at he's so big and looks tough. And then he had a cool nickname, Stonewall. Oh, my gosh, Stonewall. Yeah. And so we had to go inside and talk to the Rangers, and she had to ask questions about Stonewall Jackson. And she basically fell in love with Stonewall Jackson that day.
Oh, wow.
And that became really kind of the beginning of a lifelong passion for her for studying Civil War stuff. Stonewall Jackson stuff. I shouldn't say Civil War stuff because, we went to Petersburg once. No Stonewall Jackson, couldn't care. They didn't have the dictator, so she kind of thought that was cool. But for her, the war ended May 10th, 1863.
Oh.
But over the course of those years and studying the explorations, and I had to start learning more about Civil War stuff so I could answer her questions and figure out where to go. And that just sort of is where things took off. And we eventually got involved with Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park when she was 11 and started volunteering. We lived in Western New York, so we would drive down for 1 weekend a month, and she would work one site, I would work another, and it just kind of continued to snowball from there.
That's very cool. And that's a lot of what I hear from some of the subscribers and the followers. They talk about how they don't have the access that we have on the East Coast to some of these sites. And it makes it difficult for them to go out and see these places. And that's the reason why a lot of these videos and discussions that we have are very important to them. So that's cool to hear that background story.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in the power of place, which is why I think the battlefield preservation is so important, why I do so much work with the American Battlefield Trust and with the Central Virginia Battlefield Trust.
Right.
If we can preserve those battlefields, then we can get out there and walk around and connect with the history in a really visceral sort of way that can be super inspiring.
Absolutely. Well, you're also one of my favorite authors. Just so I'll put that out there to you.
Thank you.
And one of the specific reasons for me happens to be this book right here, Hell itself.
Oh, okay. Very good.
And the reason for it is because this book, hands down, when you go through this, you can go step by step. You can go location to location. There's a lot of information packed into this, and pictures that are added to it as well. So for a novice or someone that wants to get out onto the field, a book like this really helps them out. And for me, exploring the wilderness for the first time when I was out there, it was a lot easier to be able to go through a book like this and go place by place and try to understand it, because it's an overwhelming battlefield. I mean, there are some places at the wilderness when you walk out into the wilderness that everything seems to just pause and gets completely silent. It's almost a deafening silence, really.
Yeah.
That book to me is one of the best guides for the Battle of the Wilderness. So, being an author, what kind of painstaking process do you have to go through? Because a lot of people just assume, hey, this is an easy process. If this guy can write a book, I can too. How much work goes into that?
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but I tell because I teach writing, and I tell my students that writing is harder for a writer than it is for other people, because other people don't necessarily kind of know the mechanics and the foundations, but everyone thinks like, oh yeah, it can just kind of happen. A good writer makes that seem effortless, and there's a lot of heavy lifting that goes on behind the scenes. That said, I want to encourage anybody who thinks that they can write a book to go and do it. Like, you'll get so much out of it. It's a rewarding experience. Put in the time. The more time you put into it, the more you're going to get out of the process. You're going to experience things. You're going to discover things about the subject matter, about yourself that you didn't realize. It's going to be a great experience for you. So definitely go out and do it if you think you got a book in you. Write. But for me, it really starts with kind of having the idea, and then just doing the research and doing the research and doing the research. And then what sort of connections can I make as I'm doing the research to other things I already know, to things I thought I know, but now discovered that I don't? What can I rethink? What can I discover? How can I then walk out on the battlefields and kind of think through what I've been discovering through my research? A huge component of my writing, again, goes back to that power of place. It's very place-based. So I really like to make sure I'm walking the ground, understanding the terrain, understanding how the accounts relate to the terrain. What don't the accounts tell us about what's going on the ground, and how does the ground affect what's going on? So there's just all these different pieces, and you just kind of walk around out there. I walk around out there and kind of try to get all this to come together. And then I never sit down and actually start writing until I know in my head how I want it to start. That's for me half the battle. Because once I have that also sort of snaps together the organizational structure. And so then I'll sit down and I'll start working. And for me, it's super, super important to make these pieces stuff people want to read. I'm really, really interested in making sure that it's accessible, it's readable, it's engaging, it's entertaining as war can be. But and thought provoking. I read books. I'm sure you've read books where some great ideas, but the prose is so dense. It's almost like you think the author doesn't want you to read it. And I want people to read my stuff because I've got exciting things to share, and I want to share.
Yeah, for sure. With covering a topic like this though, how nerve-wracking is it for you to cover a topic where that first step that you take to get into it, where a lot of people know a lot of information about this, and the first thing that you're going to hear if you make a mistake or you say something that someone doesn't like, you're going to hear about it real quick.
Yeah.
How nerve-wracking is it to jump into something where there's so many experts?
I really try to approach what I'm doing with a big degree of humility, because I know that I don't know everything. And I know that there are people out there who know a lot of stuff and have strong opinions and have strong ideas. I'd be the last person to say, I'm the best expert on the Civil War.
Right.
Now, that said, I probably know some things about Spotsylvania that most people don't. And I know some things about the wilderness that most people don't. And, those battlefields that I'm super intimate with because I've worked on them and I live around the area and I'm on them all the time. But I'm always open to learning something new. So if somebody, reads one of my things and is like, oh, wait, I want to challenge you on that. bring it on. Like, I want to hear your ideas. Let me
Yeah,
test my ideas against yours, and what can I learn and take away from that?
absolutely. Bill Elrod here asked, he says his wife is planning on writing a book on the history of their area. Any advice for a first timer who's writing?
Follow your passion. Like, what is it about your area that really lights your fire? Because it's easy to write a Wikipedia entry style thing where it's just factual, 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 factual. But there's got to be something about your area that you particularly love, and so use that. That interest and that passion is kind of your way in, because if you're passionate about it, chances are someone else is going to be interested in that too, and so you'll be able to kind of hook readers using that passion. And then think about telling a story. Tell a good story. People love good stories. It's one thing to relay information, but to relay it in a way that keeps people sitting around the campfire going,
Right. Yeah.
and so, think about what's the story? What's the story? Who are the characters? And what do they want? And how are they not getting it?
Exactly. And that's one thing that you end up bringing to the story is emotion. Sometimes we bring our emotions to these things when we go to the field. How hard is it for you to kind of keep your emotions in check when you're talking about history?
And that's a great question, because ultimately we want to be able to understand the history, not pass judgment about the history. And so a lot of people in the present tend to make judgments about people in the past, and I don't think that does us any good, because the people in the past can't help it. Like, they were in their time, they can't change what they did.
Right.
They were in circumstances that were unique to them, and so really, if we can kind of understand that and approach what we're doing with empathy, then I think we'll better understand what they were doing and why they were doing it. And we don't have to agree with it,
Right.
but I think we can understand it better. So I think that's where emotion often clouds the writing process. Now, using your example about the wilderness, like, I have some pretty strong feelings about how important James Longstreet's wounding was on the second day of the Battle of the Wilderness, right? And
Right.
and I feel strongly about that. But that's because I've done a lot of research, I've walked the ground, and so I've come to conclusions that I feel strongly about, and I'm
Yeah.
glad to have those conclusions challenged. But most people who are going to come to me and be like, "Ah, James Longstreet, he was a blah, blah, blah," it's like, well, okay, here's what I've done to come to my conclusions about Longstreet. What have you done? And let's talk about
Exactly. No, that's definitely a good approach for that. So Spotsylvania is in my top three battlefields of all time, places to go. And it's not because it's the flashiest place. It's not because there's so many monuments and all this other stuff. But for me, it's because of the, I guess, almost accidental preservation of a big portion of that battlefield. There's so much you can walk there and you can actually visualize what would have taken place. And honestly, I don't know how they were able to keep it the way it was. Maybe it's because it's in the middle of nowhere. I don't know. But
it. That's part of
where
it, actually.
where does Spotsy fall for you?
Oh, definitely number one. Definitely number one for me. And again, just because I've spent so much time out there, my wife's family owns part of the battlefield, and so I've got a kind of a really intimate knowledge of it from that. I've had just wonderful personal experiences, like going out there for walks with my daughter when she was little at sunset, and seeing the wildlife, and so there are just so many different ways I have experienced Spotsy, and come to appreciate it in so many different ways. And so for me, that's always going to be number one. And like, anybody who goes to Gettysburg, it's hard to not be inspired by Gettysburg and all the monuments. And I love how Tom Desjardins, the historian, describes it as America's Valhalla. And it's the sort of
Yeah,
the honoring of the gods sort of thing. But that's the cultural landscape there. I think sometimes gets in the way. But when you go to
absolutely.
Spotsy, you're seeing what the soldiers saw when they showed up there on May 8th, 1864. And so that's a real privilege for us to be able to really put our feet in the soldier's shoes that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I kind of had a moment today that was similar to that when I went out to Hatcher's Run
Oh
earlier.
yeah.
Yeah, that was amazing. That walk off the beaten path, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, are these large earthworks on either side. It's just amazing to see that. Michael's sixth question. Lynch says, "Walking the path of Upton's assault is a sobering experience." What's your take on that assault, Upton's assault?
Yeah, and walking it is really the best way to understand it because then you can see how the topography made it an ideal place to launch that attack from the first place. Because the Federals are able to get within just a couple hundred yards of the Confederate line
Yeah.
because of the topography, and they sort of basically sneak up and then dash out for that last couple hundred yards and punch through. And you got to remember all these fortifications are pretty imposing and they're long, but they're not necessarily deep. So if you can punch through, you can have an opportunity for breakthrough. And so walking that trail, walking that ground, you're really kind of understand it in a way that looking at a map just doesn't quite illuminate. I thought it was a really bold plan. A lot of people think like, oh, this was so innovative. And it's really kind of the culmination of a lot of smaller innovations that lead up to that.
Yeah.
But I thought it was a great move. And then, but to me, the most important part about that assault is that the Army wasn't ready for that kind of innovation. So Upton doesn't get reinforced. It gets driven back. This is an attack that takes place on May 10th, 1863. For folks who aren't familiar with it, he basically takes his men into a long fist, punches through, peels open a hole, and then there are no reinforcements to flood into the hole. So he gets driven back. Grant learns from this failure. And I think that's one of the most important illuminating events of the Overland Campaign for us to understand Grant, who walks away from the war with this reputation as Grant the Busher, and all he did was these frontal assaults, and he certainly did frontal assaults, but he is an innovator. He's willing to try stuff. He's willing to maneuver. He learns well from his mistakes. And so we see all of that with Upton's attack, where he tries something new. It doesn't work. Well, what can he learn from it? How can he take those lessons and apply them in a way that allows him to try something better next time, which is what he does on May 12th for the attack against the Mule Shoe that ends in the fighting at the Bloody Angle that most people know about.
Yeah. Speaking of the Mule Shoe, one of my followers, Keith, he asked that he's heard at the Mule Shoe that there were men that were shot to pieces. Do you know of a firsthand account that points to that actually happening?
There actually is a bunch of accounts. Spotsy, for me, Spotsy is a hard battle to write about, particularly the action on May 12th, because the carnage is so awful. And there are guys who write about it in pretty explicit detail. And a lot of guys that write about it. And that's pretty incredible because the overall number of accounts from the Overland Campaign, it's not overflowing because the pace of the campaign was so unrelenting. They're fighting and fighting and fighting and moving, and it's raining on them the whole time. So we don't have the huge reservoir of accounts right after every fight the way we do after an Antietam or a Chickamauga or a Gettysburg. So the fact that so many guys, despite all that, do write about what happened at the Bloody Ankle, and they write about it in such vividness, is really a testament to how horrible that fighting was. And as a writer, to try to portray that in an accurate way without coming across as sensationalistic or pornographic is a real challenge, because you do want to represent what really happened there, but you don't want to go overboard and be so awful. Probably my favorite, and this may be a direct answer to the long question here. My favorite account or most chilling account is one surgeon talks about how a body is so shot up, he likens it to a jelly. Because the body is so shot up. There's literally nothing to hold on to lift the body onto a stretcher. They have to dig a hole and just sort of roll it in because they can't grab anything to evacuate the body.
Right. And then you have to add the weather into account there too. So it's just terrible.
Yeah. It's raining on them, for most of that fight at the Bloody Angle. It rains on them for 5 days. So it's awful. Yeah.
So with Spotsylvania, it kind of brought an idea up for me. Idols after death. With a lot of these Civil War battlefields, leading up to a battle, you're not going to hear a whole lot, or you'll hear bits and pieces about particular officers throughout the Civil War. But then all of a sudden, something happens, an officer ends up getting killed, and then there's a monument placed. And all of a sudden, there's an expert on, well, if this person would this much longer, or if they would have continued to live throughout the American Civil War, they were one of the greatest generals of all time. Some of the examples of that are, Alexander Hayes at the Wilderness, of Armistead at Gettysburg. People talk a lot about if he continued to live afterwards. And then there's Sedgwick at Spotsylvania. What's your take on Sedgwick at Spotsylvania?
Yeah, a great question. Stonewall Jackson's probably the best example of that. Everyone's like, "Oh, Stonewall had lived," right?
Right.
But Sedgwick is one of those guys that I don't know if he's a game changer. He's someone I always describe as being stalwart, dependable. If you want something done, ask Sedgwick to do it, and he will get it done. Now, it might take him a while. He won't have any flash as he does it. It is a dude who has no razzle dazzle to him whatsoever. But he is that guy you can count on him. Like you can count on him, and that'll get done. And when he is killed at Spotsylvania, Grant says that Sedgwick's loss is the equivalent of the loss of a division.
Yeah.
That's 10,000 men. Like
Right.
one guy's lost. And that's because not because Sedgwick had, pizzazz and was the great fighting general of the war, but like his men loved him so much that the morale boost that he gave them, they'd have done anything for Uncle John, as they call them.
Right.
And so, that is where I think he kind of comes in as an important factor, is that he is someone that his men are devoted to, will do things for. And in a campaign where Grant asks his men to do a lot of stuff, having that kind of leader would have been super useful.
Yeah, for sure. So, in your world of what ifs, what's one fatal flaw at Spotsylvania for the Union that, if it was taken away, would have completely changed it?
So I've got a wild dog in the background. I
Okay.
apologize. My wife was off at a bridal expo today, and now that she's come home, the dog's like, "Rawr." So a big what if at Spotsy for me, and it really kind of comes on the heels of Spotsylvania, because when the next phase of the overland campaign is the North Anna River, where they're fighting down there, starting on the 23rd. And Grant is like, "Oh, why isn't Lee attacking us? Lee set a trap. We stumble into it. He doesn't spring the trap. Why not?" And Grant comes to the wrong conclusion. He's like, the army's so beaten up that they can't attack us.
Yeah.
And so to me, that all stems from the fighting at the Wilderness in Spotsy, which is just, basically 3 weeks of just grueling, awful terribleness. And so what if Grant truly understood the toll that the fighting took on his army and on Lee's army after Spotsy?
Yeah.
He doesn't really understand that, and so that leads to problems by the time they get to Cold Harbor. So I think that maybe a more realistic assessment. What if Grant had a more realistic assessment of his army after Spotsy?
Okay. And I guess same question for Lee. What is a fatal flaw for Lee there? Something that he may have changed?
Ooh, that's a great question, because he's just running out of men. He's running out of material. He's running out of energy. He's just got to hold on. He's got to hold on. He's got to hold on. And I guess maybe that's another what if for Grant. Like, what if Grant knew just how thinly stretched Lee was? I think that would be a big part. I think for Lee, gosh, I almost think that Lee plays a perfect game through most of the overland campaign.
Yeah.
On the 14th of May, he's not all that concerned about his right flank. And Emory Upton, going back to him, he actually is able to get some troops up onto Lee's right flank. Grant had proposed a much stronger assault over there. And so if Grant had gotten into position, I think he could have really done some serious damage to Lee. But aside from that, he's pretty good through Spotsy. He's got to basically pick the ground, hold still, and let Grant call the shots. And I think Lee's pretty good about reacting to those shots.
Absolutely.
Even, I suppose people say, like, well, what if he hadn't set up the mule shoe salient? What if he created that fallback position that he ultimately creates? But he had reasons to believe that the mule shoe was secure as it was, and for reasons that he had litigated with his subordinates, and so they'd talked it all out. So I don't know if there's a way to kind of get have a different answer there.
Okay. James Thompson wants to know, what's your favorite battlefield? I think earlier you said Spotsylvania. Is that correct?
Correct. But like, I'm sitting here and I'm looking out my window in front of me, and I'm looking at the first day of Chancellorsville fighting along the Plank Road. I'm fortunate to live in the middle of some phenomenal battlefields, and I do kind of rotate around and walk around Fredericksburg or Chancellorsville or Wilderness, or, and go out to Mine Run or down to North Anna. So I'm really privileged that I get a lot of battlefields to enjoy.
Yeah, no, I think all of us here in Virginia are definitely privileged for that, for sure. What's one spot in Spotsylvania that is rarely visited that is a must-see site?
Ooh, that's a good one. So I really like Harris Farm. That's land that's preserved by the Central Virginia Battlefields Trust. That was the sort of the last major fighting at Spotsylvania. It took place on the 19th of May. There's a housing development there now, but it's a low density housing development, so you can still at least see the terrain and the topography a little bit. So if you go out there, there is a monument to the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery. There's a small parking area. But you can see the rolling hills and kind of where the fighting took place, and to me, that's a pretty cool spot. Also, I think the area where the battle opened, Spindle Field on May 8th, that sees major fighting on the 8th, the 10th, and the 12th. It's lesser known because people are always anxious to kind of get into either Upton or the Bloody Angle. But Spindle Field is really kind of a neat piece of terrain, and particularly if you know what happened there, that field has some cool things to show you.
Nice. Yeah. No, I've definitely been out there where that Massachusetts monument is, and I was kind of surprised at how tucked into everything it is. So
yeah. And if you think, like, once upon a time, it was all open, rolling farm fields,
Yeah, for sure. So you have a YouTube channel, Emerging Civil War, as well. And I watched one of your streams where you guys talked about dangerous podcast, the rise of dangerous podcasts on history.
I didn't think you were dangerous. You've got waffles. You're not dangerous at all. You've got waffles.
Yeah. Give us your take, your summation of all of these podcasts that are popping up that are covering history.
Yeah. On one hand, I think it's wonderful because people are interested in history. People are interested in sharing history. And, we're sort of in the golden age of podcasting. And so, to me, it's like watching the movie Gods and Generals. And is it super accurate? But it gets people in the door, right? And so then they come to the battlefield, and then it's the job of the historians to say, well, here's what really happened, and let me kind of help you out, right? So, like, I think all of these podcasts are really helpful in just sort of perpetuating this interest and getting people interested and getting them to battlefields and historic sites. The flip side is that, like, anybody can do it. Like, I can literally pick up my phone and start broadcasting live onto YouTube or on Facebook. I could create my own podcast on the equipment that's right in front of me. So there isn't necessarily that editorial function that there used to be.
No.
So I think it's really important for viewers and listeners to exercise a little bit of discernment. Some of the stuff can be entertaining, but where are people getting their stuff? What's the credibility? What's the source material? And so that's a challenge. You do this enough that, there's a lot of noise in the digital space, and how do you make yourself credible versus, someone else? And so that's a constant challenge, but it also requires a responsibility on the user's part to really discern that. And, the Civil War, other aspects of history too, full of its own misconceptions and myths, and people love their good old-fashioned stories that maybe aren't necessarily even true, but because they're like, and so you got to sort through all that stuff. It really requires educating yourself as a consumer.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I kind of compare it to when you first start to record things on your own. You start with something small, then you realize that maybe there's too much noise, so you add a microphone, and then you realize that microphone didn't work and you have to have a cover for it. Eventually, you start to get better and better at this, and part of this happens to be the information. The information is the most important part of it, and eventually you have to turn to credible sources to try to get it right. Because if there's one thing that I've learned doing a podcast or any kind of video, if you want to find out how wrong you are, all you have to do is put it on the internet. They'll let you know real quick.
Yeah. Well, and that's super challenging because you could be right and someone else is wrong, and they're still going to like yell at you for your right information because it doesn't match up with what they learned incorrectly,
That's true.
and that's kind of one of the things I love about public history is that you just, your ideas and your comments are challenged in real time on the spot, and you've
Absolutely.
got to be able to defend them.
Absolutely. Well, I got one last question here that I'm going to ask you, and it comes from Don Rich. It says, what if Burnside had his wish and makes another go at it at Marie's Heights?
Yeah, that would have been disastrous. The Battle of Fredericksburg, most people know on the 13th of the 13th of December, 1862, he launches 7 waves against the stone wall. Still thinks he can find success there, so he wants to personally lead his 9th Corps against that position on the 14th. And his subordinates talk him out of it. They're like, it's a terrible, terrible idea. And so he finally calls it off. And I think if he had led his troops against that position, the Confederates had already had a dominating spot there. They'd had all night to get re-equipped and reinforced and rested up and fresh troops. There's no way he could have broken through there. Now, had he tried elsewhere on the line, like the middle of the Confederate line is essentially untested, where John Bell Hood's division from Longstreet meets up with Stonewall Jackson's corps. Perhaps elsewhere on the battlefield, he might have found success, but not against that Stonewall.
Absolutely. Excuse me. Well, we're coming to the end here, and I wanted to pitch it over to you. If you have any, events coming up or books or something to look out for on the horizon, or maybe your channel, just let's pitch it out there and let everybody know about it.
Sure. I mean, I serve as editor-in-chief of an organization called Emerging Civil War. It's a digital platform. You can find us at www.emergingcivilwar.com. There are more than 30 historians providing free content every day. We also have a book series through Savis Beatty, providing sort of introductory level, easy to read overviews of different battles and stories, like Charlie was showing off earlier. We've got a symposium the first weekend of every August. Lots going on. We've got our own podcast, the YouTube channel, and it's really just a bunch of us with public historian sensibilities who are trying to share the story of America's defining event and help you folks stay in touch with that, because we can't understand who we are today unless we understand where we came from. So,
absolutely. Well, Chris, I want to thank you for coming on the show here today and talking to all the people out there. And I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule for this. And for everybody else that's out there, stay tuned. We got more people coming up here. Come on back and ask some more questions and follow up with Emerging Civil War. Great books and a great YouTube channel.
Thanks so much, Charlie. I appreciate it.
Thank you.